How to Stay Sane with Karen Jordan. We're talking with Dr. Jane Timmons-Mitchell. She's a licensed clinical psychologist with more than 40 years of experience. She's received grants totaling millions of dollars, and she's an associate clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. She's also owner of her own private practice, Junction Psychological Services Corporation, and she's a widely published author as well. In addition, she's a magna cum laude graduate of our shared alma mater, Wellesley College, and she has her doctoral degree in psychology from Case Western Reserve University. So let's talk about grief today on How to Stay Sane with Karen Jordan. Thank you so much, Dr. Timmons-Mitchell, for joining us today.
Thank you, Karen. It's really good to be here.
Thank you. So let's get started. First of all, with Father's Day right around the corner, there are many people who've experienced loss who are dreading the holiday. What would you say is the best approach to such a major holiday when you're grieving?
Right. It's such a common experience because holidays can trigger grief, and especially, kind of unfortunately, if it's a holiday that's named for the person that one is grieving, right? We do that to ourselves. We name holidays for important people, and then, if we're grieving them, it makes it especially hard.
Right.
In considering this question, I was looking at some work from psychologist Gordon Wheeler, and he says that a good idea is to use our grief to recommit to a purpose, and perhaps one that reminds us of our loved one. So, if we can think about the person that we're grieving, which is going to make us sad, but that sadness can spin to a really positive activity if we think about either something that we had previously done, or maybe something that we had been thinking about doing, or could stretch to do, that would be to honor, to remember our loved one. And so pursuing the purpose that connects us with our loved one helps us to accomplish a wished for outcome.
That makes a lot of sense. That's a very good point. What about the fact that, just overall grieving can be a roller coaster? And it can affect people's lives on a daily basis. Now, in a lot of cases, though, people try to fight emotions because, people don't want to actually talk about grief. It's a very touchy subject. What would you say to people who are trying to fight those emotions?
It is so hard, and as you say, the really tricky thing about grief, distinct from other kinds of emotional issues that we work on in psychology, is that it comes and goes kind of without warning, and also without level warning. You can just have this flash in the pan thing and be like 180 degrees from where you started, completely unaware, which makes it really hard to address it. And I think that when people try to shut it out or to control it, that actually even makes it harder. So it's funny, it's a paradox. It's kind of a hard thing, but also kind of an easy thing to do, is to accept the emotions as they are as an important first step. So not to beat yourself up. If you kind of suddenly get into a grief spiral, instead of saying, oh my gosh, I can't do that today, I've got all these other things to do, to go with it and accept it and see where you end up, because ultimately that's going to make it easier to resolve it. And it's the first step toward compassion, which is that really important aspect of loving yourself, so important while you're grieving. And it's really, especially in Western thought, it's kind of counterintuitive to what we do. I was reading some work by the Dalai Lama, who talks a lot about the importance of compassion, and that and connecting this process of accepting what is and working toward compassion as the way to address your grief.
That's very interesting. What advice do you think you would give to people who feel like they haven't been supported in their grief, though? They're trying to deal with it on their own, on the one hand, but What if they're looking for support from, friends or family members, but they're not getting it? What should they do in those cases?
It's so tricky because we know that for grief especially, but for lots of things, the way, not out necessarily, but through, is to connect with others. And yet, it can be really tricky, partly because of this unpredictable nature of it that we just talked about. And so a thing that makes it really hard to accept support from other people, or to look for it, or to frame and to say what you're looking for, has to do with how unpredictable it is, and that the goals can change. And then I think for most people who are grieving, they know that they want to have support from others, but if you ask them, okay, so what is your goal for support, it would be really hard for them to frame it. And, justifiably so. It's amorphous, and it's really hard to do that. So it's very easy to kind of say, oh, well, that person didn't provide what I wanted them to provide. And it's easy to get into a cycle of anger, mm-hmm. or distrust, or all kinds of things like that, based on, okay, so I had this interaction with this person, and I was looking for this thing, and instead what I got was this. And so, to very easily move from the feeling of whatever it is, maybe anger, to a thought that encompasses that gets kind of embellished, mm-hmm. and it isn't a really good cycle. So here's where one of the things that people like me do is to help people learn how to interrupt those cycles through cognitive behavioral therapy. And the way that cognitive behavioral therapy works is it helps to think about, okay, so let's look at objectively what was the behavior that happened. Mm-hmm. Then let's look at what the feeling was that went with that behavior. Then let's look at what thought you came up with to explain that behavior, the other person's behavior, to yourself, which could be a negative thought. And then the idea is to get to a place where you can unpack the thought that's ascribed to the behavior and see it a different way. So that's the process of establishing what are called alternative balanced thoughts. Kind of getting to a point of saying, well, maybe the person didn't really intend it that way, especially since, I kind of came on hot when I was having this thought and feeling. It makes it really hard to, on the other hand, to be the person that's trying to support somebody who's grieving, mm-hmm. because, again, of the unpredictability and the hot button nature of the thoughts. And so I think, as I said before, if a person who's grieving can say, well, this is what I want, out of this interaction, that would be great, but that doesn't happen very often.
Right.
And so if it's somebody who's very, very close, and who has sort of agreed to help support you, then I think you can have a discussion ahead of time to let them know, kind of how this process works, and to say, look, I've got ups and downs, and sometimes it's going to be unpredictable, and, your support is really important, but there may be times when you're going to offer support, and I'm not going to accept it, or I'm going to say something that you interpret as being nasty. And just to kind of have an agreement that says, with that person that says, look, I'm really sorry in advance. I don't
mm-hmm.
mean it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to work through this process, and if you'll work on it with me, then, maybe I can signal to you. And a signal, people focus on words for signals, but a signal really needs to be nonverbal, because when you're involved in a process like this, it takes all of the verbal centers. And so coming up with another, invoking another verbal cue is going to be pretty hard. So some kind of physical cue. Often I'll just ask people to raise their hand, from the wrist, mm-hmm. or if they have control of both hands, a really good one is to use both hands to make the timeout signal.
Oh, yes.
And so just to let somebody know, because that has universal knowledge attached to it, and to say, look, we just need to interrupt this now and come back to it, and that when we do, hopefully, there'll be a way to address it. The other thing that figures in on both sides here is forgiveness. along with accepting the emotion that's happening, forgiving yourself for, maybe anything that you might have said to somebody that you didn't mean, forgiving the other person for maybe not being as supportive as you would like them to be, really goes a long way to establishing the kind of elasticity that you need in those relationships at that particularly difficult time.
Those are just excellent points and very good strategies to use. Also, when it comes to grief, a lot of people are afraid of the future, of thinking too far ahead because they can barely, make it through today.
Right. Right.
How can they avoid or deal with their fear of the future when they're going through grief?
Right. I think a way to demystify the future is just to think about, the future is what happens, right? maybe no more complicated than that. It just, time passes, it happens. It'll take care of itself in one way or the other. If you want to direct it, you could think about how to do that. But really the best way, I think, is just to break it down into a series of moments, right? Mm-hmm. It's now the future compared to when we started this particular discussion.
True.
And the benefit of that is being able to demystify the process of how you get through the future, because it really is just putting one foot in front of the other. A focus that I think is really helpful in, just putting one foot in front of the other, getting through moments, is to have a focus on gratitude. Gratitude is something that's been written about recently a lot, as one of the key elements to help us change not only grief, but any kind of an adverse situation into something more positive. And there are people who have, gratitude journaling has been done for a long time, kind of giving a stem and then having somebody write what they're grateful for. But in positive psychology, they've also started talking about gratitude diets, which are really funny. I mean, it's like a journaling process, but kind of like those very old-fashioned diets, of writing down every single thing that you put in your mouth. So a gratitude diet is something like, when you open your eyes in the morning, before you get out of bed, think of 3 things that you're grateful for today, and then when you get out of bed, write them down. And then as you go through your day, at each point, it's being mindful of what you can be grateful for at that particular time. And there's just lots of really good research that talks about how focusing on gratitude is a really key element of helping someone, turn adverse feelings, adverse events into maybe not always more positive, but certainly being able to get through them.
That's a really good tip. I love that. I may try that gratitude practice myself this week.
Yeah. It's very easy, and if you just do a web search, you're going to find 15 things right away that can help you if you want help with it.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for that. And what do you think for people though who are just absolutely overwhelmed with grief? What are some tips or best practices you can give them or recommend to them to be able to function?
Right. I mean, we have to determine at what level the impact of the grief is affecting them, right? I mean, if someone really is having trouble functioning, then we would want to think about what services are available to help them with that, and there are a number. The best practices for addressing grief in psychology would include cognitive behavioral therapy, as I just said, the process of accepting yourself, which is called acceptance and commitment therapy. So, there are people like me out there who people can connect with. A number of people like me are credentialed through something called PsyPact, which is an interstate compact, so that psychologists, if you're licensed in a member state, can provide services via telehealth. So that would be telephone or video or any other such aided device for people in 41 states.
That's great.
And so that allows, broad reach and has been a really good innovation. The other things that I think are really important besides formal services, the informal, we talked about support people, that's certainly key. But there's some other things just in terms of your daily discipline that especially people who are grieving may not attend to as much. Mm-hmm. And I think if they're able to do that, I think it can be helpful. And not just me, I mean, research has shown it can be helpful. So there are 3 boxes here. One has to do with exercise or sports, and trying to get, the required amount. It's really not all that much per day or per week. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's really kind of nice about that is that depending on what you do, you can possibly also connect with other people who are doing it, like in an exercise class. Another of the boxes is music. Mm-hmm. Music has been shown to be able to retrain at the biophysiological level all kinds of things at any time. And if you can participate in music, that's great. Participate in making music. But if you don't, mm-hmm. Just being someplace where you listen to music a lot. And fortunately, that could be anywhere, right? You can
True.
Just have your own curated playlist or maybe even look at some new stuff. Mm-hmm. And then the third box is nature. And there's some really fascinating research out of Finland, but also other places, and also Japan, that talks about how just the act of being in nature is curative. And one of the ways that they think it works, and it's kind of hard for me to discuss this, I don't do it very well just because it's not a logically based concept. It's just one of those. So in Japan, they have this thing called forest bath, and that just means, walking around the forest with somebody who is trained in forest bath, and so it's mindfulness in nature. And I just think this is one of those things that immediately can lift your spirits. If you go out and take a walk in a park and hear birds singing, immediately you get a response, and it is a physical response. But the other thing that can happen without a whole lot of exposure, mm-hmm. is that time spent in nature somehow expands time itself.
Wow.
In that it gives you a new perspective to come back to where you started. And obviously more time spent in nature, can do that to a greater extent. So trying to build those 3 things in, mm-hmm. I think is really of great help. The other, let's see, I think we talked about the other key elements. We talked about forgiveness and gratitude. Mm-hmm. Respect is another one. Respect for yourself, respect for other people, and thinking about leading to joy, which when you're grieving sounds ridiculous and may sound unkind, but it's not meant to be. It's that, and as we talked about, with what the Dalai Lama said, it's like there is an aspect of joy in grief, and finding the connection and then working through it to be back to joy can be, it's a process. It can take a really long time, but it's a worthwhile endeavor.
That's so encouraging. That's very encouraging. And tell me, lastly, are there any other tips that we haven't talked about or that you haven't brought up that you think people should know or might be helpful to someone who's grieving, especially this Father's Day weekend? Right.
I'm a big person. It has a fancy name. It's called bibliotherapy. It just means reading a book that is, on topic. Mm-hmm. I'm a big proponent of that because I like to read. So there are 2 books that I would recommend highly, and they're pretty easy to get. One is the Book of Hope, which is Conversations with Jane Goodall, and she talks about how when you spend a lot of time in the natural world and with other species, you can't come to any other conclusion but that there is hope in the design. And then the other one is the Book of Joy. And the Book of Joy is a conversation with the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. And they actually have, at the end of it, it's their 8-pillared approach to joy, which if it were anybody other than the two of them, people might think was trivial. But it really is. It's pretty comprehensive. And I think spending time with those two books, because they're written in conversation, with a New York Times journalist, I think, can be a really fun and I think really helpful activity.
Those are great ideas. Thank you. You have just shared a wealth of information with us. We so appreciate you, Dr. Jane Timmons-Mitchell. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks very much.
How to stay